What if I told you that the most shocking discovery in this case wasn't a weapon, wasn't a witness, wasn't even a body? What if the most dangerous thing investigators uncovered was an offer? Not a threat, not a confession, an offer. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. $50 million. Let that number sit with you for a second. Because people don't offer $50 million unless they are trying to erase something that can't be defended, explained, or survived. So here's the question that stopped federal agents in their tracks late one night. What kind of truth is worth $50 million to make disappear? And more importantly, who was desperate enough to try? At first, the scene looked like something investigators had walked into 100 times before. A quiet, upscale property. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels staged. The lights still on. The gate closed. No sign of forced entry. No immediate chaos. Just an atmosphere that tells you something irreversible has already happened. But as the hours passed, it became clear this was not just another violent crime. This was a collapse. A family collapse. A legacy collapse. And possibly a system collapse. Because behind the bloodstains and the police tape was something much bigger than a single night of violence. There were files, old ones, carefully stored, carefully protected, carefully hidden, files that someone, somewhere, had been quietly trying to keep out of reach for years. And according to investigators, those files suddenly became worth $50 million overnight. Ask yourself this. If you were innocent, truly innocent, what price would you put on silence? Most people wouldn't offer anything at all, but someone did. And that's where this story really begins. Not with what happened that night, but with what someone was terrified investigators might find afterward. Because as agents began combing through the property, cataloging evidence, mapping timelines, and reconstructing movements, they stumbled onto something unexpected. Not in plain sight, not out in the open, but tucked away in a place that suggested intention. Someone had planned for this moment. Locked storage, redundant backups, password-protected devices. Documents that didn't match the official narrative everyone thought they knew. And that's when the tone of the investigation shifted. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about what happened. It was about what had been hidden long before it happened. You see, in cases like this, violence is often the end of a story, not the beginning. It's the final chapter after years of pressure, secrets, and compromises finally snap. And the deeper investigators dug, the more it became clear that this family wasn't just dealing with grief. They were dealing with exposure. There's a moment in every high-profile investigation when law enforcement quietly asks a very dangerous question. Who benefits from the truth staying buried? In this case, that question led straight back inside the house. Back to people who should have been united by shock and loss, but instead appeared divided by fear. Because according to internal sources, not everyone in the family reacted the same way when investigators began asking about the files. Some were cooperative, some were guarded, and some were visibly panicked. One family member reportedly asked a question that immediately raised alarms. How much of what you found is going to be logged? That question alone tells you everything. Innocent people don't ask how much evidence will be documented. They ask how soon this will be over. And then came the contact. Not a formal legal move. Not a statement through attorneys. Something quieter. Something indirect. A feeler. A suggestion that this didn't have to become what it was becoming. According to sources familiar with the investigation, intermediaries reached out with a proposal that stunned even seasoned federal agents. A deal. Money in exchange for disappearance. Not bribes in the traditional sense, nothing so crude, but a complex financial arrangement that would allegedly make certain materials go away. Lost in storage. Tied up in litigation, buried in procedural delays. $50 million. That number wasn't random. It wasn't symbolic. It was calculated. And it told investigators two chilling things. First, whoever made the offer knew exactly what the files contained. And second, they believed that if the public ever saw them, the damage would be catastrophic. Let me ask you something. If you discovered something that could destroy your family's name forever, would you fight it in court? Or would you try to buy its silence? Because one option suggests confidence. The other suggests terror. As the investigation continued, agents began mapping out the internal dynamics of the household in the weeks leading up to the incident. Phone records. Arguments. financial movements, unsent messages, deleted drafts, and a pattern emerged. This wasn't a united family. This was a pressure cooker. Conflicting loyalties, old resentments, people who knew different versions of the same truth and didn't realize how incompatible those versions were until it was too late. One individual, in particular, stood out, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. While others were talking, explaining, justifying, this person went quiet, too quiet. And when investigators pressed, the answers were vague, rehearsed, emotionally mismatched to the gravity of the situation. You know the type. The words sound right, but the timing doesn't. And that's when investigators began to consider something far more disturbing than a single act of violence. What if this wasn't just about that night? What if that night was the result of something that had been festering for years? Because those files didn't just appear. They were accumulated, curated, maintained. Someone had been preparing for a reckoning long before it arrived. And when the possibility of exposure became real, not theoretical, not hypothetical, panic set in. That's when money enters the conversation. Money doesn't fix guilt. It tries to outrun it. And $50 million suggests a sprint. As news of the offer spread internally, the FBI's posture changed. This was no longer a reactive investigation. This was proactive containment of a potential obstruction attempt. Every call was logged. Every meeting documented. Every intermediary identified. Because offers like this leave trails, and trails lead to intent. And intent changes everything. Especially when multiple family members may have known more than they admitted. Especially when silence itself becomes evidence. By the time dawn broke, investigators were no longer asking what happened that night. They were asking who had been living in fear of this moment for years. And who finally cracked under the weight of it. Because here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Violence is loud. But secrets are louder, if you know how to listen. And the files were screaming. But what the FBI uncovered next, what was buried deeper than anyone expected, wasn't just damaging. It was explosive. And once it surfaced, there was no amount of money on earth that could put it back. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if the night everyone remembers isn't the night the truth actually began? What if the real collapse didn't happen when the doors were opened, the sirens arrived, or the cameras rolled? What if it happened hours earlier, quietly, when someone realized the story they had been protecting for years was finally about to surface? Because that night didn't start with violence. It started with tension. The kind of tension you can feel in a house before anything happens. The kind that hangs in the air. Conversations cut short. Doors closed too softly. Phones checked too often. Investigators would later say the house didn't feel like a crime scene when they first stepped inside. It felt like a waiting room. Lights on in rooms no one was using. Half-finished drinks. Furniture slightly out of place, as if people had stood up too quickly and forgotten to sit back down. Nothing looked chaotic, and that's what made it disturbing. Because chaos doesn't clean up after itself. Someone had moved through that house with intention. The official timeline would later try to simplify the night. Hours compressed into bullet points. Events reduced to timestamps. But real life doesn't move that cleanly. Real life stutters, pauses, circles back on itself. And the first thing investigators noticed was that the timeline didn't breathe. It was too neat. According to initial statements, everyone had been where they were supposed to be. No one had heard anything unusual. No arguments. No raised voices. Just an ordinary night. But let me ask you something. When was the last time an ordinary night ended like that? Because ordinary nights don't leave behind silence, so thick it feels deliberate. Ordinary nights don't come with stories that align a little too perfectly. And ordinary nights don't produce that many contradictions in the first 12 hours. Within minutes of arriving, investigators separated everyone present. Standard procedure. Different rooms. Different officers. Same questions. What time did you last see them? What did you hear? Who was awake? Who wasn't? At first, the answers matched. Too well. Everyone remembered the same sequence. The same phrases. The same pauses. It was as if they had rehearsed without realizing they were rehearsing. One investigator would later say something chilling. When people lie together, they don't lie differently enough. And then the cracks began to show. One person mentioned a sound that no one else recalled. Another described a conversation that supposedly never happened. Someone else corrected themselves mid-sentence. Not because they remembered something new, but because they remembered what they weren't supposed to say. That's when the room temperature changed. Because inconsistency isn't suspicious by itself. Fear is. And fear was everywhere. But it were different faces. Some people cried. Some people went numb. And some people stayed eerily composed, asking procedural questions instead of emotional ones. How long would this take? Who would have access to the house? What items were being cataloged? You don't need to be a profiler to know this. Grief looks inward. Control looks outward. As the night stretched into early morning, investigators began reconstructing movement through the house. Footsteps, doorways, lines of sight, and they noticed something subtle. Someone had been awake much later than they claimed. How did they know? Because lights don't turn themselves off. Devices don't unlock themselves. And security systems don't log phantom movements. There was activity in parts of the house that didn't match the official story. Not dramatic activity. Quiet activity. The worst kind. One door had been opened and closed multiple times within a short window. Not enough to suggest panic. Just enough to suggest someone checking something. Or someone. And then there was the sound. A dull, heavy noise reported by a neighbor. Not loud enough to call police, but unusual enough to be remembered later. At the time, it had been dismissed as construction, or furniture being moved. But investigators knew better. Because sound doesn't lie. People do. As the first sunrise after the incident crept across the property, the house revealed details that hadn't been visible at night. Smudges, scuffs, tiny inconsistencies in otherwise pristine spaces. And in one hallway, something stood out. A faint mark on the wall, barely noticeable, but out of place. It looked like someone had leaned there. Hard. As if they needed support. As if something had just happened that they hadn't fully processed yet. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Because when investigators asked about that hallway, everyone claimed they hadn't been there. Not one person remembered walking through it. Not one. Which raises a very simple question. If no one was there, who left the mark? As the hours passed, the house slowly transformed from a residence into a record. Every inch measured. Every object photographed. Every digital footprint preserved. And that's when they found the first anomaly. A device that had been powered on, then manually shut down. Not because it lost battery. Not because it crashed. Because someone turned it off. At a very specific time. A time that didn't align with anyone's statement. When confronted, the explanation was immediate. I don't remember. That phrase came up again and again. Not, I didn't do that. Not, that's impossible. Just, I don't remember. Memory loss is convenient. Especially when remembering would require explanation. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that this night wasn't random. It was the endpoint of pressure that had been building for a long time. And pressure always leaves signs before it explodes. Financial records revealed tension. Not desperation, but movement. Money shifting between accounts. Consultations with advisors. Quiet restructurings that didn't match public confidence. There were emails that stopped mid-thread. Messages saved as drafts but never sent. And one conversation, flagged later, that ended abruptly with a single line. We can't let this get out. No context. No follow-up. Just that. Let me ask you this. If nothing was wrong, what couldn't be allowed out? As investigators interviewed extended contacts, staff, associates, neighbors, a pattern emerged. Arguments had been escalating. Not shouting matches. Cold ones. The kind where words are measured and eyes say more than mouths. One witness described it perfectly. It felt like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen and hoping it wouldn't. That's not how families act when everything is fine. That's how people act when they're running out of time. And then came the detail that reframed the entire night. A missing interval. A stretch of time, not long, but not short, where no one could account for where one individual had been. Too long to be accidental. Too short to be dismissed. When asked, the answer was vague. I was around. Around where? Around the house. Which part? I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention. You don't forget where you were on the worst night of your life. Unless remembering puts you somewhere you don't want to be. As the sun rose higher, the investigation widened. And that's when agents found the first reference to the files. Not the files themselves. Just their shadow. A note. A label. A storage reference that didn't correspond to anything investigators had seen yet. It was like discovering a key before finding the door. And when asked about it, the response was immediate and defensive. Oh, those are old. They don't matter. People don't dismiss things that don't matter. They ignore them. Dismissing is emotional. And emotion means attachment. Which brings us back to that offer. Because by the end of the first full day, investigators weren't just documenting a crime. They were documenting fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequence. Fear of something that had been waiting in the dark long before that night ever arrived. And someone, somewhere, had already decided that if the truth ever surfaced, they would rather pay any price than face it. But the problem with trying to erase a story is that the attempt becomes part of the story. And what investigators uncovered next, hidden deeper than anyone expected, would prove that this night wasn't just a breaking point. It was a trigger, and once it was pulled, there was no going back. But what came next would force the FBI to ask a far more dangerous question. What if this wasn't just a crime? What if it was a cover collapsing? What if the most dangerous evidence in this case wasn't hidden because it was illegal? What if it was hidden because it told the truth too clearly? Because when investigators finally located the reference point for the files, that quiet little breadcrumb left behind in the chaos, they didn't find a vault. They didn't find a locked safe behind a painting. They found something far more unsettling. They found organization. Neat. Intentional. Methodical. The kind of order that tells you someone didn't just stash things away, they curated them. And that realization changed the entire investigation. Up until that moment, this case had still been treated as a violent implosion, a family under pressure, a tragic breaking point, something that escalated too far, too fast. But organized records don't belong to spontaneous violence. They belong to anticipation, which raises a terrifying question. How long had someone been preparing for this? The files weren't in one place. That was the first red flag. They were spread across multiple storage methods, physical documents, digital backups, offsite references, and cross-indexed folders that only make sense if you expect someone else to come looking someday. Let me ask you this. If you believed your past was clean, why would you need redundancy? Because redundancy isn't about memory. It's about survival. Investigators discovered labeled folders that didn't match anything in the official narrative of the household. Dates that predated known incidents. Names that never appeared in public records. References to meetings no one had acknowledged. This wasn't a diary. This was a system. And systems are built with intent. One agent reportedly said something that would later circulate quietly among the task force. These files weren't about what happened. They were about what might be denied. And suddenly, the offer made sense. $50 million wasn't about deleting evidence of a crime. It was about preventing a story from being told in full. Because the deeper agents went, the clearer it became that these files didn't just point inward. They pointed outward. Connections, relationships, quiet favors, uncomfortable overlaps between power, money, and silence. The kind of information that doesn't just damage one person. It damages everyone attached to them. As the files were logged and cross-referenced, investigators noticed something disturbing. Certain documents had been handled recently, not days ago, hours, which means someone had accessed them after the incident, not before. Someone had gone looking, not to destroy them, but to check them. And that detail alone reframed the entire family dynamic, because it suggested panic, not about guilt, about exposure. Someone needed to know exactly what investigators might see. And when you understand that, the behavior suddenly makes sense. The guarded answers. The sudden interest in procedure. The fixation on what was being logged. This wasn't ignorance. This was inventory. And then came the contradiction that no one could explain. According to initial statements, no one knew the full scope of what was stored. Everyone claimed partial knowledge. Bits and pieces. Old things. Nothing important. But the files told a different story. They were labeled by topic. By relevance, by risk. Someone had evaluated their own life, or the kind of evidence that doesn't scream guilt, it whispers credibility. And whispers are dangerous, because they can't be easily dismissed. Let me pause here and ask you something. Which would scare you more? A video? Or a timeline that proves you lied? Because videos can be debated. Timelines can't. As agents reconstructed events using the files, they noticed that certain key moments had been quietly redefined over the years. Statements revised, stories softened, emotions reframed. What once might have been described as concern became misunderstanding. What once looked like involvement became coincidence. and what once felt urgent became ancient history. But the files remembered. They remembered dates. They remembered who called whom. They remembered what was said before anyone realized it might matter. And that's when investigators stumbled onto something chilling. A document outlining potential exposure scenarios. Not legal strategy. Not defense planning. Scenario planning. What if this becomes public? What if this is subpoenaed? What if someone talks? Those weren't questions asked after the incident. They were asked long before it. Which tells you everything. Someone knew this day could come. Someone expected it. And when expectation meets reality, desperation follows. That's where the offer enters the story. Because now investigators understood why the money wasn't just a bribe. It was a calculation. Someone had weighed the damage of exposure against the cost of silence, and decided silence was cheaper. But here's the problem. You can't buy silence once too many people know the truth. And by the time the files were found, that threshold had already been crossed. Multiple agents, multiple departments, multiple digital footprints. Erasure was no longer possible. But someone still tried. As forensic teams worked through the files, they found evidence of recent access attempts, password resets, login failures, metadata changes that suggested someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to alter timestamps. You don't accidentally try to edit metadata. That's a move made by someone who knows exactly what metadata can reveal. Which brings us back to the family. Because suddenly, investigators weren't just asking who committed an act. They were asking who understood the stakes well enough to attempt cleanup, who knew enough to be dangerous, who had lived with these secrets long enough to fear them. And that's when the internal fractures became impossible to ignore. Some family members reacted with shock when informed about the scope of the files. Real shock. The kind you can't fake. Others reacted with resignation, as if this moment had been waiting patiently in the background of their lives. One response, in particular, stood out. Not anger. Not denial. Acceptance. A quiet nod. A look that said, so it finally happened. Let that sink in. What kind of person prepares emotionally for an investigation before it happens? What kind of household lives with an invisible countdown? As night fell on the second day of the investigation, agents made a decision that would later prove critical. They stopped sharing details internally. Need to know only. Because the files weren't just evidence. They were leverage. And leverage changes behavior. Sure enough, the tone shifted almost immediately. Questions turned sharper. Lawyers became more present. Conversations got shorter. And behind the scenes, intermediaries began reappearing. Not directly, carefully, as if feeling out whether the offer was still on the table. Because now that the files were real, no longer theoretical, the panic intensified. But here's what sealed it. One of the files contained something that wasn't supposed to exist at all. A record of a conversation that no one knew had been documented. A moment that contradicted the public version so completely that it couldn't be spun. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was calm. And calm truth is devastating. Because it doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like a choice. And that's when the FBI realized this case wasn't about uncovering a crime. It was about unraveling a narrative that had been carefully maintained for years. A narrative built on selective memory, strategic silence, and the assumption that power would always protect the story. But power only works when no one looks too closely. And now, everyone was looking. The files were no longer just records. They were a map. And the map led somewhere no one expected. Because buried beneath the timelines, the emails, and the contingency plans was a link to something older, something unresolved, something that suggested this wasn't the first time silence had been bought. And if that was true, then this case wasn't just collapsing, it was reopening. And what investigators uncovered next wouldn't just threaten one family's legacy. It would threaten everyone who helped protect it. But what came next would force agents to ask an even more dangerous question. What if the files weren't meant to protect someone? What if they were meant to expose them? What if the number wasn't arbitrary? What if $50 million wasn't a bribe at all, but a measurement? Because when investigators finally turned their full attention to the offer itself, the first thing they realized was this. No one throws out a number like that unless it has been calculated, not guessed, not inflated for drama, calculated, which immediately raised a far more unsettling question. Calculated based on what? You see, in real-world obstruction attempts, offers usually start small. A favor, a donation, legal maneuvering. a quiet settlement. They escalate only when resistance appears. This one didn't escalate. It arrived fully formed, as if the sender already knew exactly how much silence was worth. And that suggested something terrifying. Someone had already run the numbers. Someone had already assessed the damage of full exposure, reputational, financial, legal, historical, and concluded that 50 million was cheaper. Cheaper than truth. Cheaper than consequences. Cheaper than letting the story breathe. Investigators didn't learn about the offer through a dramatic confession or a recorded call. It surfaced the way most real attempts do. Indirectly. A conversation relayed through a third party. A hypothetical floated in a controlled environment. Carefully worded language designed to test reaction without committing to anything overtly illegal. The phrasing mattered. This doesn't have to become public. There are ways to manage what's already been found. Everyone would be better off if this stayed contained. Those weren't demands. They were assumptions. And assumptions reveal mindset. Let me ask you something. If you believed the truth would clear you, would you assume containment was necessary? Of course not. Containment implies danger. As agents traced the path of the offer, they began to see just how deliberately it had been constructed. This wasn't a suitcase of cash or a panicked wire transfer. It was layered. Trusts. Foundations. Deferred payments. Legal buffers designed to obscure origin and intent. Everything about it screamed sophistication. And sophistication doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from practice. That's when the task force asked a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if this wasn't the first time silence had been purchased? Because the architecture of the offer suggested familiarity. Whoever designed it knew how to make money disappear without triggering alarms. They knew how to frame the exchange as something legal adjacent. They knew where the gray zones lived, and gray zones are where truth goes to suffocate. But here's where the story twists. The offer didn't go to the people you'd expect. It wasn't presented directly to investigators. It wasn't aimed at prosecutors. It was aimed sideways, at pressure points, at people who might influence access, timing, prioritization, not to stop the investigation, just to slow it, delay it, complicate it. Because sometimes, time is the most valuable commodity of all. As long as something isn't public, it can be managed. As long as it's managed, it can be spun. As long as it's spun, it can be survived. And that's what the 50 million was really buying. Time. But here's the fatal flaw. The offer assumed the files were static, that what had already been found was all there was. It assumed the investigation had peaked. It hadn't. In fact, the offer arrived at the worst possible moment. Because just as intermediaries were floating hypotheticals, forensic teams were uncovering something new. Not a document, a pattern, a financial echo, transactions that lined up with moments of crisis in the past. Quiet inflows, strategic outflows, money moving when stories threatened to break, then stopping once they didn't. Coincidence? Only if you believe in a lot of coincidences. Investigators began mapping financial behavior against reputational risk events. Public controversies, private disputes, legal near misses that somehow evaporated before becoming public, and the pattern held, which means the offer wasn't reactive. It was habitual. That realization shifted the FBI's posture completely, because now the 50 million wasn't just evidence of obstruction. It was evidence of a system that treated truth as a variable expense. And suddenly, the scope of the investigation expanded beyond that house. Beyond that night, beyond that family. Because systems don't exist in isolation. They require participants, facilitators, enablers, and every system leaves fingerprints. Let me ask you this. How many people have to stay silent for a secret to survive decades? Because silence isn't passive. It's maintained. And maintenance costs money. As agents quietly followed the money trail outward, they discovered entities that didn't make sense on their own. Shell organizations with vague missions, consulting fees without deliverables, payments that landed just far enough away from public scrutiny to avoid attention. Nothing overt, nothing illegal on paper, but taken together, a picture. And pictures tell stories even when people won't. Meanwhile, inside the family, the offer created fractures that no one could hide anymore. Because not everyone agreed with it. Some saw it as protection, others saw it as an admission. And one person, crucially, saw it as proof that everything they had feared was true. That's when cooperation shifted. Quietly, A phone call returned that hadn't been before. A meeting agreed to without counsel present. A question answered that had previously been deflected. You see, offers like this don't just try to erase evidence. They expose alliances, they force people to choose sides. And once choices are made, neutrality disappears. Investigators noticed the change immediately. Tone softened, details sharpened, timelines corrected. And suddenly, things that couldn't be remembered started coming back. Isn't it amazing how memory improves when you realize silence might implicate you? But the most damning detail about the 50 million wasn't the amount. It was the urgency, the window attached to it. According to sources, the offer came with an unspoken deadline, not stated explicitly, but implied through pacing, follow-ups, and pressure. This wasn't open-ended. Someone believed they were running out of time. And when people feel the clock ticking, they make mistakes. One intermediary pushed too hard. Another asked too many questions. And one message, meant to reassure, did the opposite. It referenced something the recipient hadn't mentioned, which means someone was monitoring more than they should have been able to. That's when the FBI realized the offer wasn't just an attempt to influence. It was an attempt to observe, to gauge how much investigators knew, to find out which files had been found, and which hadn't. In other words, the offer itself was a fishing expedition, and it failed, because by the time it was made, the investigation had already crossed a critical threshold. Too many eyes, too many logs, too many independent confirmations. The truth had become decentralized, and decentralized truth is impossible to bury. But someone didn't realize that yet. Someone still believed money could fix this, that the right number could make the right people disappear the problem. Which brings us to the most chilling detail of all. The 50 million wasn't the maximum. It was the starting point. According to internal assessments, contingency funds had already been identified. Additional resources earmarked, if necessary. Which means this wasn't about affordability. It was about principle. And the principle was simple. No matter the cost, the files could not become public. Why? Because buried within them wasn't just evidence of past behavior. There was something forward-looking. Something that implicated future consequences. Something that suggested exposure wouldn't just end a legacy. It would unravel a network. And networks don't go quietly. As the offer collapsed under scrutiny, investigators prepared for escalation. Because failed silence attempts often precede more desperate moves. And desperation doesn't always stay financial. Sometimes it turns personal. Sometimes it turns reckless. Sometimes it turns violent. And with pressure mounting, alliances shifting, and the truth inching closer to daylight, one question now dominated the investigation. If $50 million couldn't stop this, what would someone try next? Because whatever it was, they wouldn't wait long. And what happened after the offer failed would force investigators to confront the most dangerous possibility yet. What if the violence that started this case wasn't the end of the cover-up? What if it was only the beginning? What happens to loyalty when survival enters the room? Not survival in the dramatic sense. Not physical danger. Reputational survival. Legal survival. Existential survival. Because once the $50 million offer collapsed under scrutiny, the illusion holding the family together finally shattered. And what investigators witnessed next wasn't unity. It was fracture. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. There were no screaming matches. No public scenes. No dramatic ultimatums. Just distance. Physical distance. Emotional distance. Strategic distance. Doors that used to stay open now closed. Conversations that used to happen in shared spaces moved behind walls. Eye contact became optional. That's how families fall apart when everyone knows something dangerous, but not everyone knows the same version of it. Let me ask you something. If you believe the truth would destroy your family, but silence might destroy you personally, which would you choose? Because that's the choice that quietly emerged in the days following the failed offer. And once that choice exists, loyalty stops being automatic. It becomes conditional. Investigators noticed it first in the interviews. Same people, same questions, different answers. Not dramatically different, just adjusted. A time shifted by 15 minutes. A detail reframed. A phrase softened. At first glance, it looked like stress. But stress usually creates chaos. This was precision. Someone was recalibrating. And recalibration only happens when incentives change. Inside the household, there were now 3 distinct camps. Those who believed the truth could still be managed. Those who believed the truth would eventually surface no matter what, and those who believed they were being positioned as collateral. That last group was the most dangerous, because once someone feels expendable, they stop protecting the group. They protect themselves. One family member, in particular, began distancing emotionally almost overnight. They stopped participating in joint conversations. They stopped coordinating responses. They asked for private interviews instead of group sessions. That alone raised alarms. But what really caught investigators' attention was this. They stopped asking what investigators knew and started asking what investigators needed. That's not the behavior of someone confident in collective defense. That's the behavior of someone preparing an exit. And exits require leverage. Which brings us back to the files. Because whoever controlled access to the most damaging information controlled the negotiation. And within the family, it became painfully clear that access was uneven. Some people had seen everything. Some had seen pieces. And some had been intentionally kept in the dark. You can feel that moment when someone realizes they were never trusted. It changes everything. Conversations take on a new tone. Silence becomes deliberate. Memory sharpens selectively. And then came the confrontation that no one planned, but everyone felt coming. Not a shouting match. A quiet one. The kind where voices stay low because walls might be listening. According to internal accounts, one person asked a simple question. If this all comes out, who takes the fall? No one answered, because the silence said everything. You don't ask that question unless you suspect the answer isn't all of us. And that's when loyalty began to crack under the weight of self-preservation. One person started cooperating more fully. Another doubled down on legal defense. A third went completely silent, refusing interviews, refusing access, refusing reassurance. Free strategies. One truth. Someone was going to be blamed, and nobody wanted it to be them. Investigators began mapping internal communications and noticed a clear divergence. Messages that used to include everyone were now selective. Decision-making happened in fragments. The family wasn't coordinating anymore. They were competing. Let me ask you this. When secrets implode, do families close ranks? Or do they look for someone to sacrifice? Because sacrifice stabilizes systems. And systems under threat will always choose stability over fairness. As pressure mounted, emotional contradictions surfaced. Grief mixed with defensiveness. Shock mixed with calculation. Mourning mixed with maneuvering. You could feel it in the way people spoke about the same event. One described it as tragedy. Another as inevitability. Another as unfortunate timing. Timing. That word appeared more than once. Which begs a disturbing question. What was the event mistimed for? As investigators widened their scope, they noticed that loyalty fractures followed knowledge lines. Those who knew more were more guarded. Those who knew less were more anxious. And anxiety breeds questions. Questions breed resentment. Resentment breeds confession. One person reportedly asked investigators something that stopped them cold. If I tell you what I know, will you protect me from the rest? That's not fear of law enforcement. That's fear of family. And fear like that doesn't come from nothing. It comes from leverage. Because when families share dangerous secrets, loyalty becomes currency. And once currency is involved, altruism disappears. Now here's where the story twists again. Because not everyone was acting out of fear. One person acted out of conviction. They believed the truth should come out. Not because they wanted revenge. Not because they wanted immunity. But because they were tired of carrying something they never chose to carry. That kind of motivation is rare. And investigators recognized it immediately. This wasn't someone bargaining. This was someone unloading. Details began to flow. Not. The family was no longer a united front, which meant the investigation was about to accelerate dramatically, because divided systems leak. And once leaks start, containment becomes impossible. But before investigators could fully capitalize on that fracture, something unexpected happened. Someone tried to reassert control, a reminder of shared consequences, a warning about mutual destruction, an appeal to legacy. And for a moment, it almost worked. Fear resurfaced. Doubt crept back in. But the damage was already done. Because once someone imagines a future where the truth is known, it's hard to go back to pretending it isn't. And that's when the most dangerous realization hit investigators. The fight wasn't between the family and the truth anymore. It was within the family. And internal wars don't stay quiet for long. They escalate. They leak. They explode. And with pressure building from all sides, one final fault line appeared, one that would determine everything. Because the next decision wouldn't be about money. It wouldn't be about silence. It would be about blame. And once blame enters the room, someone always breaks. But what came next would push this family past the point of repair and force investigators to confront the one question no one wanted answered. Who was willing to let someone else go down to save themselves? What if the person who could unravel everything was the one everyone stopped watching? Because in every investigation like this, attention becomes currency. Eyes lock onto the loudest voices, the most powerful figures, the people with the most to lose. And while everyone is staring straight ahead, someone steps out from the side, quietly, unassumingly, with a story no one prepared for. That's exactly what happened here. Investigators had spent days tracking fractures within the family, following the money, analyzing the files, watching alliances dissolve in real time. They believed the next breakthrough would come from pressure, from confrontation, from someone cracking under weight. They were wrong. The breakthrough came from someone who wasn't under pressure at all. At least, not visibly. It began with a message that didn't raise alarms at first. Not dramatic. Not urgent. No demand for immunity. No legal maneuvering. Just a request. I need to speak with someone. Privately. No lawyers. No conditions. No timing demands. That alone was unusual. Because in high-stakes cases, people rarely volunteer information without asking what they'll get in return. Silence is bargaining power. Speech is leverage. Unless speech is relief. And relief was exactly what investigators heard when the meeting finally happened. The witness didn't rush. They didn't dramatize. They didn't exaggerate. They spoke like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and finally set it down. Let me ask you this. When someone tells the truth not to gain something, but to stop holding it, how much weight does that truth carry? A lot. The witness didn't come forward with accusations. They came forward with memory, context, atmosphere, what the house felt like in the weeks before everything collapsed, what conversations sounded like when people thought no one else was listening, who was afraid, and who was preparing. And immediately, investigators realized something unsettling. This person didn't just witness the aftermath. They witnessed the buildup. They talked about tension that predated the incident by months, about arguments that never made it into official statements, about moments when fear slipped through carefully managed composure. Small things, looks exchanged across rooms, conversations stopped when others entered, documents moved, not destroyed, but relocated. That last detail mattered, because it aligned perfectly with the file system investigators had uncovered, which meant this witness wasn't speculating. They were corroborating. The witness described moments when certain topics were off-limits, not because they were irrelevant, but because they were dangerous. Names that couldn't be spoken casually, events that were referred to indirectly, questions that were answered with silence instead of denial. Silence is a language, and this witness was fluent. One detail in particular froze the room. The witness described a conversation, quiet, tense, where someone asked what would happen if everything came out. Not hypothetically, practically, as if planning for weather. And a response? Then we won't survive it. Not we'll deal with it. Not we'll fight it. We won't survive it. That's not fear of consequences. That's fear of exposure. And exposure doesn't threaten people unless something exists to expose. Investigators asked the obvious question. Why come forward now? The witness didn't hesitate. Because I realized I was being positioned. Positioned for what? To be remembered as nothing more than background. To be forgotten if things went smoothly. To be blamed if they didn't. That realization changes people. Because once someone sees the outline of their future and doesn't like it, they act. The witness explained how narratives were quietly being shaped in real time. How blame was being subtly redirected. How certain people were described as emotional, unstable, or confused long before any official conclusions existed. That's not accident. That's preparation. And preparation implies intent. As the testimony unfolded, investigators noticed how neatly it filled gaps they hadn't even articulated yet. Timelines aligned. Emotional reactions matched. Contradictions softened into clarity. It was like watching fog lift. And once it did, something terrifying became visible. The family hadn't just been managing the truth. They'd been managing perception. which means the cover wasn't reactive. It was proactive. The witness described a moment that would later become pivotal. A late-night exchange. A raised voice quickly suppressed. A phrase that didn't sound emotional. It sounded logistical. This can't surface. Not this can't happen. This can't surface. Surface implies existence. Surface implies depth. Surface implies something already buried. And buried things don't stay buried unless effort is applied constantly. Which brings us back to the files. The witness confirmed what investigators had suspected but couldn't prove yet. Everyone knew about them, not the specifics, but the concept. They were referred to in vague terms. That material, those records, the old stuff. Everyone understood what those words meant, which raises an uncomfortable truth. Silence wasn't ignorance. It was agreement. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because the witness didn't just talk about fear. They talked about disagreement, about arguments over strategy. Some wanted legal confrontation. Some wanted delay. Some wanted erasure. And one faction, the most powerful, insisted that nothing could ever become public. No matter the cost. No matter who was hurt. No matter who took the fall. That faction didn't speak the loudest. They didn't need to. They controlled the resources. They controlled access. They controlled the narrative. Until they didn't. Because the witness revealed something no one had anticipated. There had been an internal warning. A warning that exposure was becoming inevitable. That digital redundancy made containment impossible. That silence was no longer sustainable. And instead of adjusting strategy, someone doubled down. That's when desperation entered the room. Desperation is dangerous. It narrows vision. It convinces people they're smarter than reality. It convinces them that one more move will fix everything. And that's when the witness described the shift. From fear to urgency. From urgency to recklessness. Decisions were rushed. Offers were floated. Contingencies activated. And people who had once been protected were suddenly expendable. That's when the witness knew. They weren't part of the plan. They were part of the shield. And shields get hit first. So they did the unthinkable. They stepped forward. Not loudly. Not publicly. But decisively. Investigators asked the question they always ask in moments like this. Is there anything else? The witness paused. Then nodded. And that pause told investigators everything they needed to know. Because pauses aren't about memory. They're about courage. The witness described one final detail. A moment that reframed the entire case. They recalled overhearing a conversation, brief, controlled, where someone said, "If it comes to it, they'll understand." Understand what? That some people had to go down for this. That some reputations were worth sacrificing. That some truths were too dangerous to survive intact. That wasn't panic. That was strategy. And strategy changes everything. Because now the FBI wasn't just dealing with a crime. They were dealing with tree-off. Decisions about who gets saved and who doesn't. As the interview concluded, investigators knew they had crossed a point of no return. Because this testimony didn't just support the evidence. It humanized it. It explained behavior. It exposed motive. And it shattered the last remaining illusion that everyone involved was acting in good faith. From that moment on, the investigation accelerated. More interviews reopened. Statements reevaluated. Assumptions discarded. And behind the scenes, the family felt it. Communication tightened. Lawyers multiplied. Silence deepened. Because someone had talked. And once one person talks, others realize they can too. But the most unsettling realization hadn't fully landed yet. Because while investigators were digesting the witness's account, a new question surfaced. One that changed the direction of everything. What if this witness wasn't the only one? What if someone else had already tried to speak and been stopped? Because buried deep in the files, overlooked until now, was a reference to something that never reached daylight. A report that was never filed. A complaint that disappeared. A voice that went quiet. And if that was true, then this case wasn't just about silencing evidence. It was about silencing people. And the next step for investigators would be the most dangerous yet. Because they were about to look for someone who never got the chance to speak. And what they found would change the scope of this story forever. What if the truth didn't stay buried because no one knew it? But because too many people benefited from not knowing it publicly? Because once investigators began asking who might have been silenced before, the case stopped being about a single family entirely. It widened. And when cases widen like this, they don't just reveal secrets. They reveal systems. Systems designed not to commit crimes, but to absorb them. Systems that don't leave fingerprints, they leave habits. The first thing investigators noticed was resistance. Not open resistance. Not defiance. Delay. Requests for clarification that didn't need clarification. Jurisdictional questions already answered. Procedural debates that should have taken minutes stretching into days. That's not incompetence. That's friction. And friction has purpose. Let me ask you something. When powerful systems don't want something to move forward, do they say no? Or do they slow everything down until momentum dies? Because momentum is fragile, and someone, somewhere, was trying to starve it. The FBI task force had expected pushback from defense attorneys. That's normal. That's expected. What they hadn't expected was quiet hesitation from places that usually cooperate automatically. Requests that used to be rubber-stamped were now under review. Data pulls that normally took hours were suddenly subject to policy confirmation. Old records were harder to locate than they should have been. None of it was dramatic enough to make headlines. But together, it painted a picture. Someone had friends in the right places, and those friends didn't need to break laws to be effective. They just needed to stall. Investigators began tracing the history of the files again, not just their contents, but how they had survived for so long without triggering intervention. And that's when something unsettling emerged. There had been moments in the past when the material should have surfaced. Moments when it came dangerously close. A dispute that almost went legal. A professional fallout that nearly became public. A private complaint that was quietly redirected. Each time, the story stopped just short of exposure. Each time, the pressure evaporated. Each time, a silence held. Coincidence? Not anymore. Because systems that protect silence don't announce themselves. They normalize it. Investigators uncovered emails that weren't incriminating on their own, but chilling in pattern. We don't need to escalate this. Let's handle it internally. There's no benefit in formalizing this. Those phrases appeared again and again across different years, different contexts, different people. Same outcome. Nothing happened. And nothing happening is a decision. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the people facilitating these quiet outcomes weren't villains. They were professionals, advisors, fixers, consultants, gatekeepers, people whose job wasn't to hide crimes, but to manage risk. And risk management doesn't ask if something is right. It asks if something is survivable. That distinction matters. Because once survival becomes the goal, truth becomes optional. One investigator put it bluntly during an internal briefing. This wasn't a cover-up. It was maintenance. Maintenance of reputation. Maintenance of relationships. Maintenance of influence. And maintenance doesn't feel criminal. It feels responsible. Until you realize what's being maintained. The task force began interviewing individuals who had been tangentially involved years earlier. Not suspects. Not witnesses to crimes. Witnesses to decisions. People who remembered being told to stand down. People who remembered being advised to let it go. People who remembered filing reports that never went anywhere. Most didn't even think of it as suspicious at the time. Because when silence becomes routine, no one questions it. Let me ask you this. If every time you raised a concern, it was calmly handled, would you assume corruption? Or would you assume competence? That's how systems survive. They don't frighten people. They reassure them. And reassurance is powerful. As interviews progressed, investigators realized something critical. No single person controlled the silence. It was distributed. One person delayed paperwork. Another reframed the issue. Another redirected responsibility. No one broke the law. Everyone followed procedure. And yet, the outcome was always the same. Silence. That's when the FBI recognized the hardest truth of all. You can't arrest a system. You can only expose it. And exposure threatens far more people than any single crime ever could. Which explains why resistance was intensifying. Because now the investigation wasn't just uncovering secrets. It was threatening stability. And stability is sacred. As pressure mounted, the task force noticed something else. The people pushing hardest for delay weren't connected directly to the incident. They were connected to the aftermath. They had reputations invested in resolution, closure, containment. Because unresolved cases attract attention, and attention attracts scrutiny, which attracts questions no one wants answered. Behind closed doors, conversations shifted tone. This was no longer about justice. It was about fallout. Who would be embarrassed? Who would be questioned? Who would have to explain past decisions? And explanations are dangerous, because explanations require timelines, and timelines reveal patterns. Which brings us back to the silenced voice investigators had begun searching for. The person who almost spoke. The report that almost filed. The moment that almost broke through. Because systems don't just suppress. They remember. Somewhere, someone had recorded that near exposure. And if investigators could find it, the entire structure would wobble. The breakthrough came quietly. A retired professional. No longer incentivized by reputation. No longer bound by career consequences. They agreed to speak. Not because they wanted justice, but because they were tired of pretending nothing happened. They described a meeting years earlier. A concern raised. A recommendation made. And a response that ended everything. This isn't something we're going to pursue. No explanation. No discussion. Just finality. And when asked why, the answer was devastating. Because of who it would affect. Not what. Who. That single sentence reframed everything. Because it confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The silence wasn't accidental. It was protective. Protective of people. And people protect systems that protect them. That's the loop. As this realization set in, investigators knew they were standing on unstable ground. Because exposing a system invites retaliation. Not violent retaliation. Professional retaliation. Reputation erosion. Budget scrutiny. Career pressure. And suddenly, members of the task force found themselves under scrutiny too. Routine decisions questioned. Authority challenged. Motives examined. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Stop digging. But stopping wasn't an option anymore. Because once you see the machinery behind silence, you can't unsee it. And the machinery had left marks. Marks that connected past near exposures to present desperation. Marks that explained why the $50 million offer existed at all. It wasn't about one incident. It was about preventing a cascade. Because if this case fully surfaced, it wouldn't just reveal one truth. It would reopen many. And reopening is dangerous. Because reopened cases don't just implicate individuals. They implicate decisions. And decisions implicate institutions. That's when the FBI realized the most unsettling truth yet. The system wasn't trying to stop the investigation because of what it would find. It was trying to stop it because of what it would connect. Because connections create accountability. And accountability is contagious. As Chapter 6 closed, investigators stood at a crossroads. They could continue treating this as an isolated case. Or they could pull the thread. And pulling threads unravels fabric. But if they pulled it, there would be no controlling what came apart. And the question now wasn't whether they could expose the system. It was whether they would survive doing it. Because what they were about to uncover next was proof that the silence had already failed once before. And someone had paid dearly for it. What happens when an investigation stops asking questions and starts setting clocks? Because once the FBI accepted that the silence wasn't accidental, that it was systemic, the case entered a phase no one could reverse. A countdown. Not to arrests. Not to press conferences. To exposure. And exposure doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks. It seeps. It announces itself in small, irreversible steps. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. A reclassification. Internal documents quietly moved from routine to sensitive. Access tightened. Distribution lists shortened. Language shifted from exploratory to definitive. That shift matters. Because it tells everyone watching, and people were watching,